Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm Tami Stackelhouse, fibromyalgia coach, author, and founder of the International Fibromyalgia Coaching Institute. The goal of this podcast is to empower you with access to the dream team of experts and coaches I've discovered are key to living the fibro life you love. From the comfort of your own home, and maybe even your pajamas, I'll help you take back control of your life and health. To help out with fibro fog, I always include full show notes and additional resources at fibromyalgiapodcast.com. Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stackelhouse. And this is episode 150 and our Ask the Coach episode. Ever since COVID-19 popped up in 2020, I have received a ton of questions about COVID, long COVID, and its intersection with fibromyalgia. You may have noticed that I haven't answered those questions as a podcast episode because, frankly, I have not had any good answers. There is just so much conflicting information and misinformation that I haven't felt like I could come on here and tell you, here's the truth that's backed by science. Which is why I am so excited to have Dr. Keith Ellis, a scientist and long COVID researcher, joining us today. Dr. Ellis shares some background on what COVID-19 really is, how it affects the body, and how it turns into long COVID. He explains what's happening in the body of someone with long COVID, some of the research, as well as the work he's done on creating a safe, inexpensive, and effective treatment that you can get yourself over the counter. I mentioned at one point of the interview today that I wish we could sick Dr. Ellis on fibromyalgia research the same way he's attacking long COVID. And if you stay tuned through the end of our conversation, Dr. Ellis and I do discuss the state of fibromyalgia research, some of the differences between long COVID and fibromyalgia, and how the interest in long COVID can really help us as fibromyalgia patients. At the end of this episode, I will also have some information for you about our upcoming free Fibromyalgia Wellness Summit that is coming in January. Registration for the event just opened today. There's some special early bird registration perks, so stay tuned after our interview for all those details, or you can just go to today's show notes, fibromyalgiapodcast.com/150. Now, let me introduce you to our guest. Dr. Keith Ellis is dedicated to helping people recover from long COVID. Using his knowledge, expertise, and experience in medicinal chemistry, pharmacology, and natural products, Dr. Ellis is researching the biological mechanisms that cause long COVID and the potential therapeutic mechanisms that can help people recover. In 2023, Dr. Ellis founded Science Driven Supplements, launching its inaugural product, CircuGuard. It's a natural supplement designed to counteract long COVID microclots. His mission is to provide safe, affordable, and readily available solutions for long COVID sufferers without the need for a prescription. Additional products targeting other underlying biological mechanisms of long COVID are in the design phase and will be launched in the coming year. Beyond his work in long COVID, Dr. Ellis serves as an associate professor of medicinal chemistry at Virginia Commonwealth University, conducting academic research in early lead discovery in the oncology field and teaching organic and medicinal chemistry to graduate students, professional students, and undergraduates. Dr. Ellis has published academic scholarly work in world-class scientific journals, including the Journal of Natural Products, ACS Medicinal Chemistry Letters, Molecular Pharmacology, and Cancer Biology and Therapy. Now, as always, I do want to remind you that the information we are including in this podcast is not meant to be medical advice, nor is it intended to replace consulting with a qualified physician or other healthcare provider. Now, we are giving you some good scientifically based information, but whether or not that information applies to you should be a conversation between you and your doctor. Now, here is my conversation with Dr. Ellis. All right. Welcome, Dr. Ellis. I'm so excited to talk to you today about long COVID. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you too.
You and I were talking before I hit record. This is kind of a charged topic.
A little bit.
COVID, long COVID, all the things. So today, for you listening, we're really going to be trying to stick to the actual science here. So if what we're sharing is different than maybe you've heard before, we're going to talk about why. So I'm excited to dig into that. But I think in order to talk about long COVID, we have to talk about COVID itself. Why don't we just start there? What is COVID?
Sure. All right. So COVID-19, as most people refer to it, I have family that just recently I couldn't go see because they got COVID when I was in town to see them. And it's still a very prevalent problem for all of us, right? So what we call COVID is what I call it acute COVID because it's an acute viral infection, right? So COVID is a virus. You in some way are exposed to the virus. It's a respiratory virus, similar to viruses that will cause cold and flu, right? They're all infectious disease pathogens, they're viruses. You breathe them in, you're exposed to them. COVID-19 particularly likes the lungs. So once we breathe it in, the particles really latch on in the lungs and start infecting the tissue. If your immune system can't fight back and kill it immediately, you end up with a COVID infection, right? And so what do acute COVID infections look like? They look like a really bad cold, really bad flu. They're typically a pretty high fever. Beyond that, 101 point, maybe even to the 102. I know when I had COVID, I had Omicron in January of 2022. My fever got to like 103. So
Woo.
you've got that really bad fever. You've got that just bone crushing, can't even function, fatigue, can't get out of bed. It's usually accompanied by some kind of both upper respiratory congestion, kind of that head cold. Often people will have some kind of cough or some kind of congestion in their chest as well from all the fluid that's accumulating from the virus having infected the lung tissue. And the acute infection is pretty bad. When COVID first hit, it put people in the hospital. It still puts people in the hospital. When it first hit, it was killing a lot of people. The virus seems to have mutated in a way that it's not quite so lethal anymore, but that doesn't mean it's any less dangerous depending on the situation, the person that contracts it, what their current health is when they get it. If you're a little less healthy, it can be a lot more dangerous, right? But with acute COVID infections, typically in anywhere from a few days, 3 to 5 days, to a few weeks, you get better, right? It's kind of like having a cold or the flu in that the majority of the population recovers. The majority of the population doesn't end up in the hospital, but we know during flu season, people do end up in the hospital just when they get the flu, right? Well, let alone
Right. Or pneumonia or
COVID-19.
any of those things. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So typical average COVID-19 acute case, which is horrible to even have to say those words, right? And the average case, people do get better. They have to rest. They have to take it easy. They're pretty much non-functional while they've got that super high fever and that fatigue and kind of can't function because their body is so inflamed and their immune response is so off the charts. But most people do get better in several days to a week or two. And maybe it takes a little more time for some people to recover, but the majority of the population recovers from an acute COVID infection and they kind of go along with go back to daily life.
Yeah. Now, when we first started hearing about things in the news, that was literally just a few miles from where I live. So it was a little bit different experience being here in Seattle as you're starting to hear things on the news, entire fire departments being wiped out with people being sick. And it was a scary deal. And you briefly mentioned this, but COVID has changed over the last 4 years or so, right? Or is it just that our bodies are more equipped to handle it or we have better treatments? What is it?
It's probably a little bit of both of the virus has changed and bodies being somewhat equipped to deal with it. So viruses in general, this is not just COVID, but most viruses tend to mutate and change over time. The best comparison I like here for how viruses change is flu season, right? We all know there's multiple different strains of the flu. And when you go and get your flu shot for the season, basically that flu shot was developed against the strain that is projected or predicted to be the dominant one for that season. Sometimes they're wrong, right? And that's why some years you get a flu shot, but you still get a really bad case of flu. It's because the virus mutated in a direction that was unexpected and your flu shot didn't help you. So COVID has done the same thing. Viruses in general, because of the way they replicate, because they replicate typically in a host, typically in us or in other hosts that are infected, there is issues with the replication of the DNA and it causes spontaneous mutations. And paired with that, they mutate in response to when somebody does get COVID, their immune system goes after and tries to kill the viruses. And it's going to kill some of them, but not all of them. The ones that survive might be genetically different than the ones that got killed. That's called selective pressure, right? And you're pressuring mutations in the virus based also on immune response in people that get COVID. So there's this natural drift in viruses to begin with. Plus, then you get selective pressure or selection of, and again, it's a horrible term to use, but quote unquote, more fit versions
Right.
of,
The
of the
survival of the
genetics of the
fittest.
virus.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
It's the survival of the fittest virus, right? So you're pushing it that way. Now, the fortunate thing with COVID is actually we aren't always getting survival of the fittest, right? Because in that paradigm, like COVID would be getting more lethal and worse over time. We're actually seeing that as the mutations happen, especially as you went from the initial COVID-19 viruses to Delta and Omicron, the virus seemed to get weaker. So that was good. Depending on where the mutations occur in the virus, kind of dictate, does the situation improve for us or does it get worse? At this point, it seems like the current strains, I honestly forget which ones we're on now because they're changing fairly rapidly and different ones are popping up as dominant in different places. But as COVID has mutated over time, it seems like the worst symptoms are maybe getting a little milder, right? It's almost like it's not quite as lethal. It's still making people very sick, but it's not putting the same number of people in the hospital and killing the same people as it did. But from what I'm seeing, it's almost actually a coin toss of it's staying just as virulent in terms of transmission, or maybe even getting a little worse, or maybe it got better and now it's getting worse. So these types of things change over time.
Easier to catch the virus if you're just out
Yeah.
and about from somebody, right?
Yeah, because it seemed like initially it was really easy to catch it. And then Omicron and after, it's almost like it got a little less contagious, right? People were not getting sick at the same frequency in the same numbers. But now it tends to be at this time of year also that sometimes it kind of ticks up. And it's a combination of, is that the virus actually mutating to be more contagious, or is it just kind of normal cold and flu season? Their immune systems are changing, it's getting colder, people are just more susceptible this time of year. So it's probably a little bit of a combination of both.
Got it. Got it. So then how do we go from acute COVID to long COVID or post-COVID syndrome or whatever y'all want to call it?
Right. So like most things, there's like multiple names now. Although I think the interesting part, I usually refer to it as long COVID. I think long COVID was kind of the patient advocated name for it. And they actually seem to have won that battle with the scientists and the physicians, which I think is amusing. I always love it when the people win over the establishment. So long COVID is this separate, I'll call it a syndrome. Maybe because it's really a set of symptoms. And typically, what happens is you get some kind of acute COVID infection. You have that for a few days to a few weeks, and then you get better, right? And maybe you don't get all the way better. Maybe you get 80% better. You still have some lingering symptoms typically for somebody that actually goes on to develop long COVID. It's usually not they have COVID, completely get over it, and then all of a sudden get long COVID. That usually is not what happens. Usually people get the acute COVID infection, they get most of the way better, but there's still some persistence in being sick, but not enough that it affects daily life. But then, somewhere between 3 to 6 months after that initial acute COVID infection, they actually start getting sicker. They get new symptoms. And that's when long COVID starts. And that's when people start having real problems because it really affects the ability to function. And it's a pretty large constellation of symptoms.
Yes, yes. I know I have a friend who caught COVID right before vaccines were even available. So she got some of the worst. And 4 years later, she is still dealing with symptoms. And she's one of the healthiest people I know, like before this started, right? So it seems as though it doesn't discriminate. Has research found any of that? Like, is it really just sort of a coin toss, or are we finding that more people are more susceptible either to COVID or long COVID?
Well, definitely with acute COVID infections, there are known risk factors, right, in at-risk populations. There's various comorbidities associated with an acute COVID infection, especially like COPD, being overweight, diabetes. Those all actually were able to be understood fairly quickly in 2020 when COVID hit. Long COVID, it's not at all clear, which is very unfortunate. In terms of being a coin toss, and this is one of the scarier statistics about long COVID, the research seems to indicate there's about a 1 in 10 chance of getting long COVID every time you contract an acute COVID infection.
So that means if you've got COVID 5 times, you've like, that's a
Yeah,
lot of multiplication.
it is, and it's a pretty scary prospect.
Wow.
And it's one of those typically with some kind of infection, you would think that actually multiple cases of the infection actually would help strengthen your immune system and make you more resistant. That doesn't seem to be the case here. You get COVID, you've got the 1 in 10 chance. You get COVID again, you get another 1 in 10 chance. It's like shooting the basketball. Every time you get COVID, you got to take another free throw and let's see whether you get long COVID or not. And it's basically a 1 in 10 chance is what the statistics seem to be saying. So that's a sobering thought for people, and it's a sobering thought moving forward in terms of I know a lot of the COVID and long COVID community feel like that it's been left behind. People have gone back to daily life and are forgetting what happened, and that everybody just wants to move on. But COVID infections are here, and they're going to be. People are going to get COVID. It's in the population now. At this point, we don't have a surefire method to really stop acute COVID infections from happening. If you've got a long-term infection like that, a virus where there's a 1 in 10 chance every time you get sick, you're going to develop a really debilitating chronic condition from it, that's a significant public health problem that you have to really think about addressing. I think a lot of the frustration in the long COVID community is that it's not really being addressed seriously at policy making levels.
Right. That's a tricky thing, right? Because that 1 in 10 chance, if we don't really know who's getting what, then the best way to prevent long COVID is to prevent COVID.
Absolutely, 100%. Because if you don't get COVID, you have a much greater chance of never getting long COVID. The long COVID cases started being reported before the vaccines came out. So if you look at the long COVID population, there's people that have been vaccinated that get it. There's people that are unvaccinated that get it. So that's not a clear criteria. There are some subpopulations of people that do seem to be affected more, but most of that is still anecdotal and there's not really good research data on it. But some of the groups that tend to have a higher incidence rate of long COVID are, first off, the demographics is kind of becoming clearer. It seems to hit women more than men. The long COVID population seems to be more 70% women. So there's that interesting. That kind of also tracks like with
I was
fibromyalgia,
thinking
right?
that's almost the same. Yeah, yeah.
That's right. So there's this interesting effect, and I've talked to a lot of these people of people that were in super fit shape, super healthy, that were endurance athletes, like ran marathons, ran triathlons, they are overrepresented in the long COVID population.
Really? That's
Yeah, very,
interesting.
very interesting because you're like, these people were super healthy. How can this be?
Yeah, and that's what I just said about my friend too, right? She's one of the healthiest people I know.
Right. And that's one of the things that made me think of it. And what it seems to be the case that, especially in the high performance athletes, it's two things. When you do that kind of training, it depletes your energy system. So that seems to put them at risk, and it also kind of affects the immune system. And it's evidently well known with those types of people that are doing that kind of training towards the ends of like long, heavy training cycles, they're more susceptible to getting sick, both from the energy depletion and the immune system effects of putting all that stress on their bodies. That's probably why they're more overrepresented in the long COVID population, even though it's like these people are healthy. If they get it, how can any of us escape it? Right? Because that's kind of the natural thought. The other population that seems to be more at risk for long COVID seems to be people with issues with the immune system. So that can be people that just have naturally weak immune systems that do often get sick or have those types of issues, but also people that have things like autoimmune diseases, right? And again, this is starting to sound familiar
Yes,
to
it does.
fibromyalgia, right? So
Yeah,
and I think the thinking there is that whatever is going on with the immune system being out of balance and not functioning at the highest level that it can, not functioning the way it should be, is what makes the people susceptible to long COVID. But the molecular details for all of that and the real trends and patterns in subpopulations in long COVID, they're still being studied. And I haven't seen any like really, well done concrete studies in terms of patient subpopulations and risk factors in long COVID yet.
got it. Got it. So, we're talking about the best way to prevent long COVID is to not get COVID in the first place. I'm getting on an airplane tomorrow and flying to Arizona. And I'm thinking this might be a time that I want to wear a mask and make sure I wash lots of hands or no.
I'm mixed on that one. I think if people feel like that will help them, they should do it. As long as they are really doing it because it's more for them than for anybody else around them. If they're sick, they shouldn't be traveling, right? So if you're going to wear a mask and you're traveling, right, it's supposed to be to protect yourself. Depending on the mask, you have to get to some pretty beefy masks to really be able to filter out viral particles. So while it will help if somebody, sneezes right next to you, in the close confines of a plane, I don't think it's unreasonable. But at the end of the day, is it foolproof protection? No, most likely not, because particle sizes being what they are, typical surgical masks are not going to help, but so much. Honestly, if I were going to fly, what I would do is I would go to the pharmacy before the end of the day and go get some airborne or some elderberry, some kind of immune boosting type product. That's actually more of what I would be loading up on. Or if all else failed, just load up on high dose vitamin C.
Yep, I started that yesterday. Did I start soon enough or should I have started sooner?
It depends on how high dose you're going. Are you going up to the 1 to 2 grams a day level? You'll
For
probably
vitamin
be fine.
C, yeah.
Yeah. So, but honestly, that's what I would do. And I would almost think that helping the immune system, taking things like some kind of immune support or vitamin C are almost as good or better than any kind of physical barrier.
Excellent. I love that. My husband got COVID, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, and we didn't know that's what it was because he didn't get that sick. It was just like a little bit of a sore throat, a little bit of a sniffly nose. And so by the time he found out, I mean, we hadn't quarantined or anything like that. And I sit right next to him. I sleep next to him, right? I actually never did get COVID, even with all of that. And I think a lot of it is exactly what you're talking about. I do a lot of immune system boosting things. So,
So, I mean, the immune system is there to protect you. And if it's working properly and you're exposed to the virus, it should crush the virus before it has a chance to really make you sick. So,
yeah. So let's talk about what's actually happening in the body, because I think that is one of the areas where there's a lot of confusion. We talked before we started recording about what's the difference between long COVID and fibromyalgia, because there is so much overlap. So I would love for you to share what you found about that.
so long COVID is problematic for people that get it and for the healthcare system kind of on its own. because it's not super well defined. There is a definition for it. Part of that definition is that time window past the acute COVID infection, that 3 to 6 months. But then beyond that, it tends to be more of a constellation of symptoms and not a very specific diagnostic criteria. There's no clinical blood test to tell you you have long COVID. So when really somebody thinks they have long COVID, they're going to go to probably their primary care is going to look at them, and they're going to have one or more of a bunch of symptoms. And this is the other thing that I think is really a confounding factor with long COVID is long COVID has what I think of as this set of core symptoms, and then this constellation of broader symptoms where people get some of them, but not all of them. And people get different ones, so that a lot of times not everybody's long COVID looks the same as the next person. And I think that's really frustrating for physicians because it makes it very difficult to diagnose. And a lot of those symptoms overlap with other things like fibromyalgia, like chronic fatigue syndrome, like the effects you see from West Nile and Lyme. There's just a lot of overlap, and it's somewhat difficult based on symptoms. So the core symptoms in long COVID are, again, where it's kind of very similar to fibromyalgia, right? It's typically fatigue, it's typically brain fog, some kind of mental clarity issue, and there's typically some type of cardiac involvement, some kind of shortness of breath or tachycardia or issues with maintaining heart rate. Those are kind of what I think of as the core symptoms that just about everybody with long COVID experiences. And then beyond that, there's this huge constellation that not everybody tends to experience, but they experience maybe one or two of them, and then the next person will experience a different one or two of them. It's more severe cardiac symptoms, so more severe tachycardia or things like POTS, things like dysautonomia, where they're having trouble with that autonomic nervous system, be it heart rate, be it breathing, be it their circulation. It's where the neuropathy comes in. It's where the muscle pain comes in, and then the joint pain and stiffness as well. You can see additional neurological effects like depression and anxiety on top of the brain fog. Some people have GI involvement, they get gut dysbiosis, right? Or leaky gut. And then you also have typically immune system type effects to the point where some people will go as far as having mast cell activation and other immune type reactions and involvement as their long COVID gets more severe. So it's this constellation of symptoms that crosses multiple systems in the body physiologically, which frankly, medicine is just not well set up to deal with that, because when people experience this, they go to their primary care. The first thing their primary care does is they're going to run blood work. One of the infuriating things with long COVID is you do all the blood work you want to do, and the blood work comes back pretty much normal. There's nothing in standard clinical blood work that pops really for long COVID. There is a laboratory-based test for some aspects of long COVID. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but your standard clinical testing doesn't find anything abnormal, right? So then people get shifted over to, you're having cardiac issues, let's send you to the cardiologist. You're having neurological issues, let's send you to the neurologist. The long COVID patients I talk to, they get cycled through a series of specialists, and when they're done, they still don't know what's going on. They're still so sick that they have compromised function in their own life, right? They're not really functional. They're struggling to work and take care of their family and spend time with their loved ones and do everything they want to do. And they've done all that, and they're not any closer to any answers, which I'm sure rings true to you in a lot of ways.
Oh, goodness. Yes. And I don't know about you listening, but the whole time that Dr. Ellis has been talking, I'm over here nodding my head, because that whole story that you told, except maybe for the cardiology part, like some of that, like you don't see fibro people typically referred to a cardiologist, some when we get into POTS and all of that. But yes, like this is our story. We see all the people, all the tests are normal. Nobody knows what's wrong. Oh, maybe it's this. Oh, maybe it's that. But we never get any answers. So, yes. That's us. So I'm going to actually rewind for a second here because we didn't talk about this. How on earth did you get like so deep down this rabbit hole?
This is really a rabbit hole I had not really planned on going down, at least not this way. So, my background is I'm a scientist, I'm not a clinician. So, I am what we call a medicinal chemist. I'm an associate professor of medicinal chemistry. And what medicinal chemists do is we're basically the academic specialty that does drug discovery. So it's a combination of chemistry, organic chemistry, pharmacology. We're the ones that take all biochemistry, we're the ones that take all that data, all that information and say, okay, let's go start making drugs. So I kind of started working on long COVID in early 2023. It had been long enough. COVID had been around for a while. A lot of people, a lot of work was being done on acute COVID. I was kind of more interested in long COVID. It was emerging as a real problem at the end of 2022. There was a lot of research money going into COVID and long COVID, a lot of papers being published. And I figured at this point, it's been long enough. There should be enough informational literature, enough biochemistry, physiology, pharmacology for me to come in and do what I normally do, which is I typically, when I'm starting a new project in my academic lab, I'll go into the scientific literature and I'll say, okay, I want to work on this disease state. Now I need to go understand the molecular mechanisms of the disease state in the body, how it's causing malfunctions in normal physiology for people and how it's making them sick. And then my job is to pick, okay, here's a protein that we know is malfunctioning. Now let's go make a drug that actually hits that molecular target, that protein. And that's how we start developing therapeutics. It's an area that I think of as what I call early stage lead discovery is kind of what I'm interested in because I like doing interesting things, new mechanisms of action. That's kind of always been my interest. So early 2023, I went to the scientific literature. I said, okay, let's go figure out what's known about long COVID in terms of the molecular mechanisms of why this disease is making people sick, what it does in the body, and let's start figuring out how we can start developing drugs to treat long COVID. Because what I don't think most people are aware of and really appreciate is it takes a long time starting from zero to discover and develop new drugs. The accepted timeline for that process is it takes about 10 to 15 years to develop a brand new drug and get it to market, starting from where you're selecting that protein, that molecular target, all the way through your discovery process, your development process, clinical trials. It's usually 10 to 15 years. So in 2023, I was like, somebody needs to get started on this because
Right.
people are still sick and are not getting any better, right? So let's get moving on this. So I went into the literature and I knew ahead of time that there was just massive amounts of data being published in the COVID space and with long COVID in there as well. So I expected to find a lot of really good information. And by the time I was done looking at the scientific literature, I was both shocked and angry at the same time because despite the amount of data being produced, and it's all good work, and I don't mean to disparage anybody. I'm saying I was shocked and angry because there's a lot of science being produced. It's a lot of high quality work. What I was shocked by was that there was not more focus in the literature and more urgency behind saying, okay, what's really causing long COVID mechanistically, and how do we start getting to the point where the preconditions are met to do drug discovery? There was no focus on that in the scientific literature. It shocked me, and I thought about it for a minute, and I said, with that lack of focus, all of these people that have long COVID, there is not help coming for them anytime soon. And that was kind of the part that made me mad. Around that time, I had a good friend that had long COVID. He had experienced the carousel of physicians that he had ridden and still had no answers. And he came to me after that and said, Keith, what is going on here? How can there be nothing to be done for long COVID? And that's when I really kind of took a step back and said, the path that I normally go down to do an academic project, there's just not data in the literature yet. And it was one of those things that it kind of made me sad, right? Because we all know science takes time. Science is a process. And everybody in science depends on usually somebody else reporting some kind of data, making some kind of discovery, and then they can do their own work. And I'm no different. I depend on the scientists that do a lot of that basic biology, the basic biochemistry, the basic physiology to do all that mechanistic work before I can do the work I want to do. That just wasn't there. So I kind of went back to the literature with a different mindset and a different set of questions. And I went back with the mindset of what is well enough known right now to be able to do something to help people. And that is what really generated the rabbit hole that I went down to do the next set of work that I did.
That's awesome. I love that. I think it's important for us as patients to hear what you just said, that it takes a good 10 years plus from first idea to having a medication, right? And so many of us are so frustrated because fibromyalgia is the same problem, right? And we're like, we need new treatments. If somebody starts on it now, that's still 10 years away.
It is. I mean, there are shortcuts you can take if you figure out a way to repurpose an existing pharmaceutical drug or something over the counter. There are some shortcuts, but at the end of the day, unless you have a drug that is already in the drug discovery pipeline, you're a minimum of 5 years away from repurposing anything because that's how long it takes just to get through clinical trials. And if you have to invent something new, it is more like the 10 to 15. And that's when there's preconditions met to actually start doing that work. Because I went to start looking at fibromyalgia because I don't know a whole lot about fibromyalgia because I don't work on it. I've heard about it a lot. It's a chronic condition. And I had that kind of shocked and angry feeling again when I was looking at fibromyalgia because there's even less mechanistically known about the what I think it was pathophysiology, the mechanisms that cause it at a molecular level. There's even less known about fibromyalgia than there is about long COVID right now, which is not good. That's not a
That's
way to
ridiculous.
successfully actually do anything to help people. So it surprises me because fibromyalgia has been around for a long time.
The first reference in medical literature is 200 years ago.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that old, but I remember the late 90s, early 2000s, people talking a lot about people having fibromyalgia. And I think that's when Lyrica hit the market, if I remember correctly. It was
Yeah, Lyrica
sometime.
was like early 2000s. 1990 is when the diagnostic criteria was officially set and published. So, yeah, if you're listening and you were diagnosed prior to 1990, that is for sure the dark ages. And I guarantee you that whatever you were told then, we know a whole lot more now. So, but still not enough, right?
No, and that also tells you how we prioritize research funding for chronic illnesses, which further underscores that the only way we're going to do something to really help people is potentially doing some things that are outside the box and treating them in a different way than the system has, because the system is not serving people well.
Yeah, no, it is definitely not. So now that we're down your rabbit hole, I've seen in some of your videos, and I've heard in other places too, people talking about microclots. What is that, and how is that in the context of COVID, long COVID?
So when I went back to the literature to say, okay, what do we know enough about for long COVID to actually try to actually help people? One of the few areas where there was a lot of good mechanistic data and people were trying to actually focus on piecing together, okay, what's happening molecularly that can be causing long COVID is the collection of scientists that were working on the microclot hypothesis. They did a lot of really good experiments. There's a lot of good data, which I like because I'm a data driven person. Like I want to actually see those experiments. And basically, the microclot hypothesis says that viral proteins from COVID, and specifically the spike protein, bind to a protein in the blood. And it is a protein called fibrinogen. It's the main protein involved in forming clots. And the microclot hypothesis states that spike protein binds to fibrinogen and causes an unnatural change in conformation of that clotting protein. And that unnatural conformation then goes and starts sticking to other proteins and starts polymerizing, and it forms these larger clots and they call them microclots. At the end of the day, the important thing is that number one, they're unnatural, right? They are this unnatural conformation of these proteins. They are unnatural clotting that's occurring in the bloodstream. They're sticky. They stick to a lot of stuff. They stick to platelets. They stick to red blood cells. They stick to other smaller proteins in the bloodstream. They form these microclots. They're induced by the spike protein. The hypothesis is that those microclots actually account for and explain a lot of the downstream symptoms that you get in long COVID. They can explain the fatigue from causing poor oxygen delivery into the tissues, which it expends all the oxygen in the tissue, starts making you more tired, right? It explains the brain fog by actually causing less oxygen delivery to the brain. That starts doing some of the CNS effects. The cardiac effects, because these microclots are occurring in the bloodstream, they're causing inflammation in the blood vessels. So you're getting inflammation of the entire circulatory system. And then also explaining the cardiac symptoms, like some of the issues with shortness of breath, with tachycardia and other heart rate issues. And it can go as far as explaining even the POTS and the dysautonomia. And one of the ones that is really an interesting one is microclots can also account for some of the CNS effects like depression and anxiety. Because when the platelets are activated by binding to the microclots in these complexes, they dump all their serotonin. So you get serotonin depletion from the microclots, which causes the more mental health type symptoms. So the microclots hypothesis, in its own way, is a unified theory of a mechanism at the molecular level in people that's able to account for a lot of the symptoms of long COVID. And presumably, if you can help counter those microclots, if you can break them up and get rid of them, then people would start recovering from long COVID. And the really nice research that kind of sold me on it, because I'm a chemist by training, I like structure, I like molecules. The investigators that were doing a lot of this work, they made spike protein in the lab. They put it in human lab samples, blood samples. And they actually were able to show that when you put the spike protein in, it actually made these microclots form in blood samples. And they came up with a test to be able to detect microclots. Now, it's a research laboratory test. It's not something a physician can order. It's done with a fluorescent dye and a microscope. Right, but it can be done in the research lab. And as you go through a lot of the data in the microclot area in long COVID, basically every patient that met the diagnostic criteria for long COVID that they tested, they were able to find microclots in that person. And again, you're talking small samples, but again, with the state of the literature currently in the long COVID area, that's going pretty far and is really solid work that was very convincing to me.
Yes, yes, I agree with that. Boy, I tell you what, we need stuff like this for fibromyalgia because we don't. I mean, we know little bits and pieces. Like I used the analogy with you before we started recording that I think of fibromyalgia like the elephant in the parable of the elephant and the blind men, right? Like we're seeing pieces of the elephant, but we don't really know what causes fibromyalgia. We know there's some mitochondria dysfunction. We know we have heightened pain processing. We know various things like this, but something as concrete as we have microclots for COVID, we need that.
The surprising thing with fibromyalgia is all of the interventions are still really looking at treating symptoms. They're not really looking at treating causes. A lot of, I think, the focus in long COVID that people have taken has been in trying to treat symptoms. There's a lot of been kind of repurposing of existing pharmaceutical drugs or existing over-the-counter either drugs or supplements to try to do some of treating those symptoms. But a lot of times nobody's really drilling down and looking at, okay, mechanistically, why are you using that? Why should it work? And it's great that it works for some people. And you never want to tell people, that shouldn't have worked. I don't know why it does. Like, that's not what you want to tell people, right? It's like,
No.
if it worked for you, great. But now we have to figure out why so that
Yes.
it can help somebody else. But a lot of the things that are available and that people are using, they are treating symptoms and they're not really treating root causes of what's going on. And that's problematic because if you don't really start treating the root causes, people will never really get better. It will be a chronic condition forever that they are managing, but not really ever recovering from.
Right. So for you listening, if you're not totally following what we're saying here, treating the symptoms means taking pain meds because you have pain, or treating your fatigue, or figuring out how to make your brain fog better. But we're not actually treating what's causing those things in the first place. Right. And so you end up just treating all of this outside stuff. I don't know. It sounds like treading water to me, right? Like you're just trying to keep your head above water, but you're not actually draining the pool.
And to a certain extent, there's kind of almost a number of stages or a life cycle you go through with the disease state. Do you always want to try and make people more comfortable and treat the symptoms? Yes, but you don't want to stop there. You want to do the next step and actually try and find the causative reasons of why does this disease occur? What are the mechanisms? And can we actually do anything? The interesting thing about these chronic diseases, they don't get as much attention as the other disease states that you can see have gone through this process. Like to a certain extent, it's like for cancer, we had chemotherapy. Why did we need anything else? No, that's not what you do. Chemo wasn't always effective. It was a horrible experience for people. I just taught a lecture on chemo drugs this week. The example's fresh in my head, but we didn't stop trying to find drugs to treat cancer when we had chemo agents because we knew we could do better. The last 20 years of oncology research has been about, okay, we know we can do this base level, but now we know we can do better than that. And it's interesting that similar mindset isn't applied to a lot of these chronic diseases in terms of really trying to advance further the research and the available options for people that are suffering from them.
Yeah. I heard one of our fibro researchers at a conference said, we need to study the people who got better, not just the people who got sick.
Oh, you always want to do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I don't think there's much of that being done with fibromyalgia. Largely, I think because there aren't very many of us who have gotten better. Like
I
that's
was
not
going
the
to ask
normal
that question.
story.
Yeah, right.
Right, right. If anybody's listening, I am totally up to be a guinea pig. My fibro's in remission, has been for years. So I'm happy to help with that part of the problem. So, where do we go from here? I know you've developed some things to work on
Mhm.
those microclots. So, let's talk about that.
So, in going through the microcloud hypothesis, one of the reasons I love the scientists that have worked on the microcloud hypothesis is they took it to the logical conclusion and they actually tried a treatment strategy for people with microclots and it actually worked. They did a small study of long COVID patients. It was like 90 patients. And they tried a known pharmaceutical cocktail called triple anticoagulant therapy. So it's three anticoagulant pharmaceutical drugs given together. And in this small study, again, it was like 90 people. They all had long COVID. They were kind of diagnosed with clinical criteria to have long COVID, and they tested them all for microclots at the beginning. They all had microclots. So they said, okay, they gave them triple anticoagulant therapy. And in that study, 80% of the patients recovered from their long COVID.
Wow. How quickly? Do you know? Do you remember?
So it depended on how severe their long COVID was. They stratified them. They had two groups. The kind of milder long COVID, they were on it for 2 to 4 months. And in the severe long COVID, they were on the therapy for like 4 to 6 months. And then at the end, they retested for microclots, and the ones that got better, the microclots were gone. So
That seems fairly conclusive.
And again, it was a small study. Was it a large, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trial? No. But at this point, to me, that's really good data in the long COVID area of, okay, this is a way to help people. So at this point, I was talking to a lot of people with long COVID, and I was like, there's triple anticoagulant therapy. Why aren't you all taking this and just getting better? And what I was hearing from people was they couldn't get a doctor to prescribe it. So I kind of dug into that. I was like, what's really going on here? And it turns out there's three issues with triple anticoagulant therapy. The first is it's three anticoagulant pharmaceutical drugs you're taking at the same time. There's a significant risk of bleeding as a side effect.
Yeah, I was thinking, don't get hurt.
Right? So it's a serious, cocktail of pharmaceuticals. If I was a physician, would I just want to give that out? No. Like I get that, right? So the first issue was there's significant side effect worries. The second issue is there was an access. You had to find a doctor willing to prescribe. The doctors weren't super willing to prescribe it. Also because there wasn't a lot of evidence-based data behind using it, right? It's a small study. The way we train physicians now, they always want all kinds of clinical trials data to prescribe stuff.
Evidence-based medicine.
That's right. And then the third issue was cost because insurance companies wouldn't always cover it. These are, especially one of the drugs, one of the newer anticoagulants is not cheap, right? And if they're not going to cover it because it's being used off label, that makes it more expensive. So the story I got from the patients was a lot of these private COVID treatment clinics have popped up across the country and across the world in the past few years. So you could go there, and a lot of those clinics have gotten the lab tests set up to be able to test for microclots. You could get triple anticoagulant therapy, but there's super long waiting lists because there's not that many of them, and they're private pay. So you're paying out of pocket. It's hugely expensive to actually go to those practices and get treated. Avenue you could go to try and really get it from people who believed in it was way too expensive for a lot of people, and it often involved a lot of travel that people just were not physically in shape to do. So knowing and understanding that was the situation, there was a safety issue, kind of an access issue because you had to have prescriptions, and a cost issue. Kind of said to myself, what long COVID people really need is a safer, which also means kind of less potent version of triple anticoagulant therapy that they can buy over the counter and is cost effective, right? So I kind of thought about it for a little bit, and my background in medicinal chemistry, I have a little bit more of what I think of as an old school background. My PhD is actually in natural product total synthesis. It's in organic chemistry. And then I did my postdoc training. My mentor specialized in taking natural products and using them as the lead molecules to discover new drugs. And when I became an independent faculty member, that my first projects were of that type. We don't really do drug discovery that way anymore. That's changed over the past 15 years or so. But it got me thinking of I used to take natural products and then use those to discover drugs. That's the way we discovered drugs for a lot of the 20th century.
So that would be things like, okay, willow bark helps with pain, and then now we're going to see how that works and turn it into something else.
Right. That aspirin.
Kind of.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of. Right. That's interesting because willow bark is going to come up again in a minute. So that's always been the historic process. And we don't use that process anymore typically in doing drug discovery because we have all these fancy, sophisticated scientific things we do. But I was looking at the problem and I said, I need something less potent. And I said, what if I reversed the normal process? So I knew I had three pharmaceutical drugs that were basically too strong and too good at doing what they were doing, but worked on long COVID. I said, how about I reverse the normal process and I start with the pharmaceutical drugs and I reverse engineer them into natural ingredients that would do the same thing. And the way you do that is using what we call mechanism of action, right? So when we have a pharmaceutical drug, the molecular target or protein that it hits, that's what we call the mechanism of action. So I took the mechanism of action of the three pharmaceutical drugs. I said, okay, let me go in, let me find the natural products that have the same mechanisms of action. And it was basically a one-to-one replacement of doing those. That gave me three natural products that could be combined to be what I think of as a natural version of triple anticoagulant therapy. And that's actually what I designed and formulated. And basically, it's the first custom formulated over-the-counter supplement that is specifically designed for people with long COVID to help them recover.
Awesome. Congratulations. That's huge.
So, and you mentioned white willow bark, that's actually one of the components in it. So, the drugs that are in the pharmaceutical cocktail, the anticoagulant is apixaban. When you go through the mechanism of action, the natural replacement for that is turmeric. The curcumin in turmeric has the same anticoagulant mechanism as apixaban. The second component is aspirin, right? So when you go back through mechanism of action, white willow bark has ingredients in it that are COX-1/2 inhibitors, which is that mechanism. And then the last component in the pharmaceutical cocktail is a drug called clopidogrel, which is a P2Y1, P2Y12 receptor antagonist. And there's a natural product called Dan Shen extract. It's a traditional Chinese medicine. It has natural products in it that have the same mechanisms of action. So I took those three, added a couple more things. I added black pepper extract, which if you take turmeric, you know that's now in most turmeric formulations because it helps with bioavailability of the turmeric. And I added some beetroot extract to help people with tissue oxygenation to help with fatigue. Do people take that for fibromyalgia?
I haven't heard that, but with what we're talking about today, I'm going to have to check into that because that is a problem.
Right. So beetroot extract increases your nitrous oxide levels in your bloodstream, which actually helps with the use of oxygen by tissues. So I put that in there. So those five ingredients are what I formulated into the product that I made for long COVID that I call CircuGuard.
Excellent. I love that. Quick question. When you were talking about the anticoagulants, if somebody is on something already, like my grandma was on one, my mom's on one, is that protective in any way?
So, and this is really interesting. And this is part of the work I did before I made the supplement. Was I looked in the literature? Do anticoagulants alone help with long COVID and help with long COVID microclots? Does aspirin alone? And the answer is no. When they did trials with a single anticoagulant, an actual pharmaceutical anticoagulant, it doesn't help with long COVID. Same with aspirin. You need all three mechanisms together. So the way they work, that the pharmaceutical cocktails actually, it's one anticoagulant and two platelet activation inhibitors. So it's three different mechanisms of action. And basically what they do is, so going back to microclot hypothesis, right? Spike protein binds to the clotting protein, makes this unnatural conformation of it. That's what makes the microclot. What triple anticoagulant therapy actually does is it slows down clotting in the body that would otherwise be happening. So, in retarding or pulling back clotting, it allows the body to step in and actually clear the microclots. So, by slowing down clotting, you keep new microclots from forming while the ones that are there are naturally cleared by the body. So that's what the pharmaceutical version of triple anticoagulant therapy is doing, right? And again, that's what the natural one is doing. It's just with less potent ingredients that you actually don't have to get a prescription from a doctor to take, right?
And you're less likely to bleed out from.
And you are, right? And that combination together, if you take each of those components separately, there's very low bleeding risk. The only one that they tell you, like if you're having surgery, they tell you, okay, if you're on anticoagulants, you got to stop taking them. Turmeric is sometimes on that list. I think usually on that list, but the other ingredients in there are not known to be strong, like anticoagulants. And turmeric itself, people can take up to like a gram or two a day. If you go on Amazon, you can find like 2,500 milligram turmeric capsules. It's very non-toxic, it's very safe, and even if that at those higher doses, there's a fairly low bleeding risk. And in the amounts that I put them in my formulation, there's only 400 milligrams of turmeric per dose. You're way below any kind of dosage where you would have a lot of issues.
That's great. So as people are reading that label and, most of those ingredients are things we've heard of before and may even be taking, right? Like a lot of people with fibromyalgia will use turmeric or curcumin for pain, right? But putting them together the way that you did makes something special, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you have to be taking all three components together in the first place for the mechanism to really work once you take them. And from a drug delivery, like absorption point of view, they actually do work better when they're mixed together in one capsule. And I have a little bit of anecdotal data for that. I had one person that was following my work because when I did all this work, all this research, all the formulation, I just published it all. I put it all on a Substack, right? Because people with long COVID, and I think people with fibromyalgia as well, they're extremely well informed about what's going on with them because they have to be advocates for themselves. Everything I did, I was very open about and just said, okay, here it is, read it. If you agree with it, great. If you don't, tell me why, kind of thing, right? So I released the formula before I manufactured the first batch of product
Oh, wow.
because I was researching, I was telling my audience about it. I said, okay, because it had a little bit of a lead time, right, to get it made. So somebody in my audience started taking all the components separately. And immediately it started working for her and she started getting better. But then once she got her first bottle of my product and took everything together in one capsule, she actually said she could feel the difference, that it was better taking all of them together than taking the ingredients separately. So if anybody wants to, you can buy the ingredients separately and just take them. As long as you're taking everything together so that they can work together.
Like at the same time, not like some in the morning, some at night. Yep. Yep.
Right. You have to take it all at the same time. So it's all getting absorbed at the same time, all getting in the bloodstream to act together at the same time. That's the important part because you have to have all three of those key components on board at the same time in order to really deal with the microbes.
Got it. So how do people find it? How do people find you?
So they can find me at keithcellisphd.com. That's kind of my page of links to everything. So if you want to go to one site and find everything, it's keithcellisphd.com. There is a link to the Substack of research. There's also a link there right at the top to the product called CircuGuard, where it'll take you to the easy ordering page for it. And there is a full web page on it that lays out all the research. That's all on the Substack as well. There is one detailed product page for that. All my social media is there. As I was doing the Substack, I was also making a lot of videos on TikTok, and I've put them on YouTube as well. If people want the more digestible video version of the Substack pieces, they can check out my social media. There's a link there if they want to email me. They have questions. I do write back. I read my own emails. I do write back. And there's a link to my LinkedIn page because there's a lot of people with a lot of letters after their names working in these spaces and talking about things and trying to sell things. So if you want to check out my academic credentials and actually see I am who I am and do what I do, my LinkedIn link is on my profile as well at keithcellisphd.com.
That's awesome. I did that. I checked you out. As you can imagine, I get lots of emails from people saying, "Hey, can I be on your podcast?" Not knowing who you were. I'm like, "Oh, who is this guy?" Long COVID is something I want to talk about, but it's got to be with the right person. So I'm glad you
Right.
reached
And
out. This was awesome.
yeah. And I understand people's skepticism, even to the point of cynicism, right? I totally understand it, especially for people with any chronic disease because they are fighting an uphill battle no matter what. So my goal has really been to give people information and then products to help themselves get better, right? Not be at the mercy of whatever doctor will decide to take an interest and help you. Really, the reason that I ended up making my product was to give people a solution that they could try for themselves that no one could tell them they couldn't have.
Right, right. That is the beauty of that. And it's exactly the same with fibromyalgia. Feeling like we're at the mercy of our doctors or even the pharmacy, whether or not they're going to fill our prescription or is insurance going to cover it, right? All of that. So these over-the-counter, do-it-for-yourself options, I think, are crucial for chronic conditions, especially because we have to deal with it every day, right?
Absolutely. And we need these types of products that are actually designed based on the science behind these conditions, right? Like there's lots of people selling supplements that say they work for X, Y, or Z, but are they really based on mechanistic data from the literature? And that was really what my goal was. When I ended up going down the rabbit hole, right? When I couldn't do what I normally do and start trying to make a drug. It's if I'm going to do something, it's got to really be backed by the scientific data and what's in the literature that can potentially help people. And that's what I tried to create.
That's excellent. We need to sick you on fibromyalgia.
Well, if I could find a little more mechanistic data on it, we could get started.
Oh, do you have a friend that can research that part?
Just for you, I'm gonna look at it a little more because I was really trying to look at it more today. And interestingly, I teach, right? I'm a professor. We don't touch on fibromyalgia in most of the med chem stuff we teach. It's not a disease state we talk about. It's one of those, it's like now I'm annoyed. It's like, is there really not this data out there, or is just it's not well enough known? And I fear what the answer is, but
It's
I will
really
start
not there.
tracking that down.
I actually just read a survey type research article that looked at rheumatology research and like the percentage of research for whatever illness. Fibromyalgia was second to the last. And we probably
Really?
affect the most people because it's 7.7% of women, 6.4% of the population overall. For women, that's 1 in 13. That's a huge number. And second to the last, the only condition that had fewer research articles was scleroderma.
Again, it shocks me those numbers are that low. This is where the system doesn't make sense to me sometimes. That would happen that way because what it also tells me, and I haven't looked, but I can only guess what the numbers are like for NIH funding in that area if the publications are that low, right? Because there's usually a direct correlation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So, that just means that enough money is not going into the research to be able to get that done.
Exactly right. And some of the researchers I know are sort of being sneaky with their fibro research. So they are researching pain or they're researching fatigue, more pain, chronic pain, big problem, lots of money, but fibromyalgia, not so much. But that also then affects like everything downstream, right? If this is a study on pain and not really a study on fibromyalgia, then yeah. So
we'll have to work on this. I know there's been an increasing movement that, to a certain extent, and you hate that it has to happen this way, but to a certain extent, the interest in long COVID, the need in long COVID, the vocal patient population in long COVID has actually helped been a little bit of a boost to some other chronic conditions that are kind of similar to the point that now that some of them like chronic fatigue syndrome and West Nile and Lyme are all kind of getting lumped in together as these what they're calling post-viral reactivation diseases. And the thought is to try and kind of push to study them as a group because there's data that implicates microclots in chronic fatigue syndrome. And there's starting to be studies trying to look at it. Are they also a causative factor in Lyme disease and West Nile? You're getting you're getting analogous microclots. They're being caused by a different viral protein from a different virus, but you're still getting microclot formation. And that's why a lot of the more global symptoms are very similar between all of those chronic diseases because there's a similar but not identical molecular cause it would be kind of a coin toss whether you could have one therapeutic that would help all of them or whether they're each going to need an individual therapeutic because the molecular details are different, even though up at the symptom level, they're all very
they
similar.
look the same. Yeah, exactly.
What disease is most similar to fibromyalgia?
So a lot of the ones that you've mentioned get lumped in. MECFS and fibromyalgia, sometimes you hear people talk about them as one thing. I think there's some differences, but there's also a lot of similarities. And then, of course, a lot of the autoimmune rheumatological things, right? So they're like lupus and all that kind of stuff. But with fibromyalgia, we don't have any actual physical damage like you would see in lupus or RA or those types of things. So, yeah, we don't know what the elephant looks like. We don't know what's causing all of this stuff. And I would be really curious to know if this microclot issue is part of that at all, or if it's not.
And I did some searches today to see if anybody had looked at microclots in fibromyalgia, and I didn't find anything.
Yeah, I haven't heard
So,
anything, but yeah.
and I have not heard. So most of the MECFS stuff that I look at is post-COVID. So it is being tied closer to long COVID and more along the post-viral reactivation mechanism than I think before COVID, where it was more nebulous and more like fibromyalgia. So that literature has almost shifted a little bit. And part of that, I think, is positioning, trying to hopefully
Advantage of the interest, the funding, everything
it is.
else.
It's the boats, the tide lifting all of the boats, right, and not getting left behind. And with fibromyalgia, because it almost seems from what I've seen in literature now, I haven't been looking for fibromyalgia stuff, but it's almost like there's more on ME/CFS in the literature than there is on fibromyalgia from a mechanistic point of view.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that from a mechanistic point of view. Yeah.
That's interesting to me because chronic fatigue syndrome has been around for a while, but fibromyalgia has been a disease state with a drug in the clinic for longer than that. And that's what I think is puzzling about why there's not more research on it.
It is a problem we need to solve.
It is. So hopefully, as the future turns to more of these chronic disease states, all the boats really will get lifted with the tide, and fibromyalgia will get brought along with long COVID and MECFS.
Yeah. One of the statistics I've seen is that about a third of the people who end up being diagnosed with long COVID end up also being diagnosed with fibromyalgia. So the number of people with fibromyalgia is going to grow, right? The number of people with that diagnosis, because COVID's not going away. And I think there is going to be a lot more eyes on this, which hopefully means more dollars on this.
And hopefully it's going to become that way to the point where somebody starts asking questions of how do we differentiate these from each other? How do we differentiate long COVID with or without fibromyalgia? Which starts leading you to ask more mechanism-based questions than simple clinical symptom ones.
Yes. And, from what we've talked about today, some of the things that come to my mind, I mentioned this earlier, but with fibromyalgia, we don't see quite the same like cardiac stuff as you typically see with COVID. And then with fibromyalgia, we do have that overactive fight or flight, the overactive pain response, that amplification of things that I don't think is true of COVID or long COVID, is it?
I have not heard about the elevated fight or flight. What was the other one you said?
Just this amplification of pain signals. And I think of fibromyalgia like an amplifier where it just sort of turns the volume up on our pain, things that would hurt this much.
And actually, now that I say that, I have talked to some people that usually they couch it more in terms of anxiety. So it's two effects, right? It's the microclotting causes activation of the platelets, which leads to serotonin dumping. So you're dumping out and causing a lack of storage of serotonin. So it's not there over time. The other thing is a lot of the GI issues in the leaky gut. COVID's been shown to affect serotonin transporter in the GI tract. So you're not actually getting as much serotonin transport into the body. And if you're dumping the internal reservoir from the platelets, they're both contributing to that anxiety. It'd be interesting to see what serotonin levels are like in fibromyalgia patients.
Typically.
Just low.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, whether it's from the same cause or not. Like I happen to know that I have the short allele that means I don't make serotonin well. So I know I have other issues. But I take a lot of things to help boost serotonin for me. And I do see that with a lot of my students and clients too, that for most of them, serotonin is an issue that has to be addressed. So, yeah.
That is interesting. And that is interesting to see what the actual mechanism. So the mechanism is low serotonin synthesis because of it. Is it a single nucleotide polymorphism or is it just a shortened allele?
Oh, you're going beyond my ex vocabulary.
Either way, it's a genetic issue,
Yes,
right? So
it's a
it's
genetic
not.
issue. Yeah. I might have other things wrong too, but I do know for sure that my body doesn't make serotonin like it's supposed to. So, yeah. And I don't know how much that's true for everybody either, right? Because we haven't even identified like there are some things that are tied with genetics. Like, I did 23andMe, right? And recently they put out a thing that said, your likelihood of developing fibromyalgia. And it was not any higher than anybody else. Like it was normal, but I have fibromyalgia. So, there's clearly still some things that we don't know.
And a lot of times, whatever panel they're running in that, like 23andMe, it might not be covering the newer genes that are now known to be causing some of those issues. So, but again, another one is, you talk about the genetic issue that leads to low serotonin production. That alone, like that would be a nice study right now. What is the prevalence of people with long COVID that have that issue?
Yeah.
Right. And again, these are some of the types of questions that there's a lot of what I think of as basic research being done in literature. People drilling down into things where if they worked on neuroinflammation before COVID, they're now working on neuroinflammation in long COVID or COVID, and they're doing those studies. And that's all great work, but there's not a lot of attempt to try and tie things together between these chronic diseases and really understand causative mechanisms of, okay, there's neuroinflammation, but what's causing the neuroinflammation,
Right.
right? It's
Yes.
okay, you're really laying out how the neuroinflammation is happening, what pathways are being activated, what is actually going on with that specific neuroinflammation in long COVID. What's the root cause of it, which is what you need to know to make people better. And that's kind of data that interests me that is frustrating when I am not able to find it.
We are on the same page. So, as we wrap up here, what do you see in the future? Where do you see all of this going?
I mean, there's like the optimistic, happy version, and then there's the really bad, not optimistic version, right?
Let's do the
So,
bad version first and then the optimistic version so we leave people with a little hope.
so from what I'm seeing, pharmaceutical industry has not really started working on long COVID, kind of similar the way they're not working on fibromyalgia or a lot of these other chronic diseases. To be fair to pharmaceutical industry, I think their problem is the same problem I'm having. There's not the data they need in the literature as the starting point. So I get that. But what that really means is you're beyond a 10 to 15 year horizon because there's got to be time to develop the body of literature necessary to start developing those types of drugs. So the dark, like, not very happy story is I don't think there's a lot of pharmaceutical solutions coming for long COVID or for any other of these chronic diseases anytime in the near future. That's the bad part. The good part is all of these patient populations and the people that are suffering from these diseases have gotten a lot more vocal. They've gotten a lot better educated. They've become advocates for themselves. They are all becoming self-taught in the important science behind the disease states. And when people do that and make noise is typically when things happen. So I think the optimistic view of is at some point enough noise is going to get made that I would maybe think maybe it's more hope than really think, but I would hope that there will be some kind of more like chronic disease initiative that is putting money into these chronic diseases, maybe in a little more focused and unified way, seeking to really ask these fundamental questions of what's causing these diseases and trying to really drill down to generate the data necessary to actually start helping people. I would hope that at some point we're going to actually start trying to treat chronic diseases that way. And I think in the meantime, the stopgap solution is the kind of the approach that I've taken is to take the science that's out there and let's figure out what we can do now that's safe and effective, which is probably more of natural remedies for people to use and try and have a better quality of life and actually feel better and at least partially recover while they're waiting for more sophisticated pharmaceutical therapies that are more like cures or long-term chronic treatments for the diseases.
Yeah, I see what you're seeing. Like I'm seeing that with our fibromyalgia community. I've got friends that have gone to Washington, D.C. and met with lawmakers to talk about funding and things like that. And as patients, that is hard for us, right? Because we're sick. But it's also, I think, in many ways more powerful when you have the people who are living with it. But we have to actually tie that in then with the people who have the concrete data and the research and that kind of knowledge to say, okay, now here's what we can do with that.
One of the reasons I have hope, and I don't want to get political, and it's only tangentially political, but I actually have some hope that maybe RFK being in charge of HHS, which means he's in charge of NIH, could potentially move things more in that direction. Because we all know he's not going to go easy on the pharmaceutical companies, but the general Make America Healthy Again movement is not only about getting healthier, removing kind of toxins and things from the environment and food that we shouldn't be, but also going back to using some more of these natural type remedies that can help, and in some cases either are all there is, or in some cases have certain advantages sometimes over pharmaceuticals and the side effects that comes with them. So part of my hope is actually that there's potential for disruption in the system, that if the people like you're talking about that are advocating for the chronic diseases, if they actually step in and try and capitalize on it, that actually could move things in a way that we're not used to.
Mm. Yes, I like that. Like that's it, right? We're taking advantage of the opportunities that we're given to move things forward. I mean, it's going to take all of us, right? So you listening, yes, you need to be an advocate too. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to Washington, D.C., but your voice is important. Thank you so much for this. And you are welcome back anytime. If you come
Oh,
across
thank
new
you.
data or whatever, reach out to me. I'd love to have you back.
No, I've really enjoyed being here and talking to you, and this has been a great conversation today. Thank you.
And that wraps up my conversation with long COVID researcher, Dr. Keith Ellis. We will have the links Dr. Ellis mentioned today in our show notes. Just go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com/150. I will also have links to a couple other episodes, including episode 132, where I discuss advocating for fibromyalgia research funding with Melissa Talwar, and episode 110, where I discuss the process of designing and bringing new medications to market with Dr. Seth Lederman. Again, you'll find all of that at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/150. I also want to let you know that today, registration for our January Fibromyalgia Wellness Summit has opened. Today, December 17th. This summit is going to be held January 20th through the 31st and is going to be different than other summit events you may have attended. This is not going to be one of those events with 80 different talking heads, experts who don't live with fibromyalgia, and so much information you can't actually even make use of it. That is not what we're doing here at all. This is going to be very different. Our theme for this summit is living well with fibromyalgia, real patients, expert advice, proven results. because that's what we're going to be talking about. 3 of the ways that our summit is going to be different. First of all, every single one of our speakers is someone who is living with fibromyalgia. I will be speaking along with 6 of my certified fibromyalgia coaches and 1 guest speaker who is a secret right now. And in addition to being experts in our own particular areas, we also all have fibromyalgia, right? And even more importantly, we have all found ways to improve our fibromyalgia significantly. I personally have my fibromyalgia in remission. It's been in remission for several years. Many of our coaches are getting close to remission and have improved their fibromyalgia symptoms by an average of 75%. So if you can imagine only having a quarter of the symptoms you have right now, that's where these people are who are going to be speaking to you. Second, we are making this very fibro-friendly. We are giving you 1 speaker each day, Monday through Friday, weekends off. So it'll be 10 days, 10 speakers to make it super fibro-friendly and super digestible for you. And then third, all of these summit talks are going to be delivered directly to you as a podcast. So it's not going to be part of the fibromyalgia podcast because we don't want to clutter up the podcast feed for the people who aren't interested. So you will have to sign up for the Summit podcast separately in order to receive the recordings, but they are going to show up right there in your favorite podcast app where you're listening to this right now. Also, this event is absolutely free. If you are someone who wants to have all the extra goodies, we also have a VIP all-access backstage pass to receive some bonus gifts and access to our VIP green room, which is a private VIP-only Facebook group where you can interact with our speakers, with the other VIP attendees. You can ask questions and honestly just experience the community that I am always talking about on here. Plus, if you sign up as a VIP, you will have access to a live bonus class with me and a live screening of the fibromyalgia documentary, Invisible, with a Q&A and live chat with the director. Our VIP pass is on sale right now. Again, early bird pricing before the end of December 2024, but you can sign up at any time. Now, to register for the free event or to purchase those VIP backstage passes, you can go to fibrowellnesssummit.com. Now, make sure you get all those 3 S's in the middle there, Fibro Wellness Summit. Lots of S's in the middle. We would love to have you join us. We are so excited about this event and how it's going to be different than most of the other things we've had out there. So I'm going to leave it there for today. I will see you back here next time with one of my student coaches in training, Kirsten, and she is going to be talking about goal setting. She's also going to talk about her recent hike to Everest Base Camp. See you next time. And that wraps up another episode of the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami Stackelhouse. For daily doses of hope, inspiration, and practical advice, come hang out with me on Facebook. Visit facebook.com/fibrocoach to find my personal coaching page and connect with me directly. To find the show notes, additional resources, or to schedule a consultation with me or one of my coaches, visit fibromyalgiapodcast.com.